when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate but equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish them. These are the opening words of the Declaration of Independence, and just about everything you need to know and take to heart to be a good American you can find right here. Hi there, I'm Pete Fenzel, and this is In Their Own Words, the story of the American experiment in the words of the people who made it happen. If you haven't guessed by now, today's episode is the story of the Declaration of Independence. It's the story where the American experiment began. Now, the Declaration of Independence is America's birth certificate. And what better place to discuss the birth of America than right here at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the American eagle was hatched and where the Declaration of Independence was adopted, and where we chose to become one people in a new nation in words so clear and so true that neither we nor the rest of the world has ever been the same. Why did the Declaration of Independence happen? How did it happen? What impact has it had upon mankind and us? Well, over the next few minutes, let's consider all this and see what we might be able to discover. In answer to the question, why did this happen, one need only read the document itself. It contains 27 separate grievances against the king, which are the causes which impel us to the separation. The short answer is that by the spring of 1776, we had been at war with Great Britain for more than a year. Most of the American people knew by then that reconciliation with the king was hopeless, and that reconciliation meant absolute subjugation to the king, increased oppression, and the loss of all of our rights and freedoms. Also, Thomas Paine's essay, Common Sense, was incredibly persuasive to thousands upon thousands of Americans who came to adopt the American cause for independence. It was a logical and a compelling argument against monarchy and in favor of American independence. Besides these factors was the stupidity and the actions of the king himself. So what did the king actually do? Well, let's go through the list. The king waged war against us.
Oh, great.
He declared us outlaws and then rebels. He denied us all legal protections, burned and destroyed our towns and cities, revoked our laws, plundered our trade, dissolved our legislatures and our courts, denied us fair trials, and attempted to pose his will and the will of Parliament as a false yet total authority over all of our lives. He sent his armies here to kill us and to oppress us, and he hired armies from Germany, mercenary armies, to kill us as well. He hired Native American tribes to kill men, women, and children in the backcountry settlements. His aim was to crush us into submission or in the words of Thomas Jefferson, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Now, in addition to the tyranny of the British Crown, there's another good reason, and a big reason why the Declaration of Independence was necessary. We lacked just about everything necessary to wage war against the British Empire. They had the biggest, most professional army in the world, and we had a bunch of undisciplined and untrained farmers. They had the greatest navy in the world, and we had almost no navy, and almost all of our entire population was on the Atlantic coast. If we had any hope to win independence, we needed allies like France or Spain. But no European power was going to form an alliance with a bunch of rebels. If we had any hope to form an alliance, we had to become an independent nation. So how did the Declaration of Independence happen? Well, on June 7th of 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, on instructions from the Virginia Convention, proposed a resolution to the Congress. And now on your screen, you're going to see that resolution in Richard Henry Lee's own handwriting. And that proposed resolution was given to the Secretary of the Continental Congress so that he would have an accurate statement of the resolution to propose. That resolution read as follows: Resolved that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. That it is expedient forthwith to make the most effectual measures for forming foreign alliances. That a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. Congress took up that part of the resolution having to do with independence, holding the other two parts off until after the resolution of that issue. But 4 days later, Congress appointed a committee of 5 men, called the Committee of Five, to draft a Declaration of Independence in the event that the Virginia Resolution was passed. And those 5 men were Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Ben Franklin of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, John Adams of Massachusetts, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Robert Livingston of New York. Now, drafting the document fell to Jefferson because he was reputed to be the best pen in Congress, and he was also a person who had written widely on political matters. Jefferson sought to express clearly the state of the American mind, and he succeeded brilliantly. Sherman and Livingston did next to nothing, but John Adams and Ben Franklin made some semantic changes to the draft which actually improved the document. But when the Virginia Resolution passed on July 2nd, 1776, the Congress, as a committee of the whole, took up the actual final wording of the Declaration of Independence. They made a number of changes which blunted some of the most eloquent passages that Jefferson had written, but the document itself survived substantially intact, but for one provision. Jefferson had written a 28th grievance against the king, and it was the longest grievance, and it was the grievance about the institution of slavery. And that grievance read as follows: He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes he urges them to commit against the lives of another. On July 3rd, 1776, this 28th grievance was hotly debated in Congress. Jefferson writes that South Carolina and Georgia threatened to oppose the Declaration of Independence unless that grievance was stricken from the document. And also that the 28th grievance was opposed by powerful New England shipping interests which profited greatly by the transportation of enslaved peoples from Africa to North America. Well, that 28th grievance was stricken from the Declaration. But the slavery interests failed to delete from the Declaration those powerful 5 words in the second sentence, that all men are created equal. And that phrase communicated to the 28th grievance, and yet that endured. 85 years later, those 5 words from the Declaration of Independence would necessitate a bloody civil war, the deaths of 750,000 American men, in order to rid us of the stain of slavery and to give America a new birth of freedom. So the next day, the 4th of July of 1776, Congress adopted the final language of the Declaration of Independence and had the Declaration read to the people right here on these steps. Then they had a printer named John Dunlop overnight print up 200 copies of the Declaration and had them circulated among all of the assemblies and committees of correspondence of the different states, as well as to the Continental Army and to other European powers. But the original Declaration of Independence had to be written fair on parchment for the purposes of preserving it over a long period of time. And it took a while to engross fair the original parchment of the Declaration of Independence, so that it wasn't until August 2nd of 1776 that the delegates to Congress came back here and signed the actual original document. At least most of them did. So what were the effects of the Declaration of Independence? Well, short term, the effects were immediate and profound. Jefferson had described us in the first sentence of the Declaration as one people. And the Americans responded intuitively to that. They felt the pressing need to be one people and to form a union of the 13 states. And so later in July, Congress took this up and approved Articles of Confederation by November of 1778. The American people were very supportive of the new Declaration. In fact, they were very enthusiastic about it, except for, of course, the Tories, who were the Loyalists, the faint of heart, and those who were self-interested, looking out for what was good for themselves. But the American people were going to need this increased enthusiasm for their own country to withstand the rigors of war over the next 7 years. The Continental Army was absolutely ecstatic. They now were fighting for their own country, not just for some political settlement with the king. And they made the sacrifice of their well-being and perhaps their lives worth that much more, that they were fighting for their own country. They would need every measure of this increased devotion over the coming years Because as they read this declaration, thousands upon thousands of British soldiers were landing on Staten Island in New York Harbor, and the times that try men's souls was about to begin. Now, copies of John Dunlop's print of the Declaration circulated throughout Europe, and it was translated into many different languages. European countries like France and Spain and the Netherlands now had to consider how this new American nation, if it survived, would change all of their global relationships. And in fact, after the Americans won the Battle of Saratoga against the British in October of 1777, France did form an alliance with the American states and provided both military and material support, which was decisive in our eventual victory over Great Britain. Now, the long-term effects of the Declaration are almost impossible to overstate. Before, we were insignificant peasants in a hierarchical and aristocratic society with a distant king and his nobility. Now, we had to form an egalitarian society based upon the principle that all men are created equal. We wrote constitutions for all of the states, and eventually a federal constitution for the United States, guaranteeing to all our God-given rights, limiting the power of government over us, and extending equal protection under the law to all people. Now, just as the Declaration of Independence necessitated a bloody civil war to rid us of the scourge of slavery, the force of the Declaration has continued to pull us towards a society where the unalienable rights of all are cherished. In this, his finest moment, Jefferson intended the Declaration to be a clarion call to all of mankind throughout all time, to cast off their chains and to assume the blessings of self-governance and the full expression of human rights. And so it has been. The first such instance was the French Revolution in 1789. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man is derived from our Declaration of Independence. And since then, many independence movements have used the principles, if not the exact words, of the Declaration of Independence in their independence documents. The American War of Independence may have ended in 1783, but the American Revolution continues. The Declaration of Independence is the expression of the American soul. It is our North Star, guiding and inspiring each new generation to make America better and to bring it closer to its founding principles, as long as people continue to take to heart the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The American experiment will endure. Now, the Declaration ends with the following commitment. And for the support of this Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And so, how about yourself? What do you pledge? That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you liked it, would you please share it with your children, with your families, with your friends? Thanks for watching. God bless you.